Welcome, everyone. I'm Doug Holtz-Aiken, president of the American Action Forum, and we are delighted to have the latest installment of the Fred Malek Lecture Series. The Malek Lecture Series is dedicated to the proposition that good policy requires sound ideas and design, but it also requires people to put those ideas into action. And we are pleased today to have another exemplar of the idea of policy ideas in practice, the governor of the great state of Louisiana, Bobby Jindal. And the absolutely appropriate person to introduce him is Fred Malek, for whom this series is named. Fred.
Thanks for being here. Thank you, Bobby, for being here. I had the honor of founding this organization. Gee, Doug, it's over 5 years ago now, almost 6. It is an organization that has grown beyond my expectations, certainly, and done a lot more than I ever expected it could, thanks to great leadership from Doug Holtz-Aiken and a great team here at the American Action Forum. I'm proud to be your colleague. I'm proud to chair it, and proud to see you continue to fight above your weight. I mean, you really make a difference in the policy discussions in this country. We are privileged today to have somebody who has made a profound difference in the policy issues of this country over an already extensive career at a very tender age. Bobby Jindal, you all know him as the governor of Louisiana, and that's what people think of him. But you got to go back and look at the background of this man. Here he is, coming out of Louisiana at age 22, I think, a Rhodes Scholar. At age 25, he is named Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services of the state of Louisiana. It's a huge department. During that period, he saved Louisiana Medicaid from bankruptcy. At age 27, he was made the president of the University of Louisiana education system, higher education system, I think 16th largest in the country. That's at age 27. And in each of these jobs, he has excelled. He's set an example for others. He went on, of course, to become Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services here in Washington. Was elected to Congress at the age of 33. And elected governor not too long after his second try. He really has shown great leadership, I think, in the state, particularly when you think about some of the tragedies that have hit our country and who have been heroically standing tall and accomplishing something in the face of adversity. Bobby has done that. More recently, or actually throughout his tenure as governor, he has demonstrated his conviction in standing for smaller government, more power in the private sector, more incentives to the individual, less reliance on government, and it's exemplified by the fact that he's cut $9–10 billion out of the state budget while he's reduced taxes. I mean, that is a pro-growth, conservative agenda that I think would serve everybody in this country, including the people here in Washington who just can't seem to get it right. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce somebody who I've come to know as a friend and who I admire greatly, Bobby Jindal, Governor of Louisiana.
Thank y'all very much. I want to thank y'all for coming out. I want to first of all thank Doug. We go back several years. I want to thank him for his friendship, his leadership of this very important organization. I want to thank Fred especially. He and Marlene have been great friends to me personally, have been great leaders in the RGA, has done a phenomenal job. It's no exaggeration to say we wouldn't have the number of great Republican governors we do if it hadn't been for his own generous support, but also his leadership in convincing and telling others the reason it is so important for us to elect great Republican governors in red, blue, and purple states. Now, I want to try to give some brief remarks today and then save more of our time for questions. And I'm going to limit my remarks to 3 areas that are centrally connected, but I'd be happy to talk about other issues as well. I want to talk to you today about, first of all, the importance of investing in America's military. Secondly, the ongoing challenge to make sure that Iran does not become a nuclear power. And third, what America must be doing to defeat the enemy named ISIS. And President Obama and his administration is coming up short in all 3 of these areas. They are failing in all 3 of these areas. Let me start first with the importance of investing in America's military. You know, Fred and Doug and I were reminiscing before I came in here. We've been together on a lot of different campaigns. In 2012, I spent a lot of time campaigning for our nominee around the country, saying that President Obama had been the worst president since Jimmy Carter, and that he did not deserve re-election, and that I felt like it was better that Mitt Romney would be elected instead. After that election, I actually came back to D.C., and at CPAC, I delivered a speech where I apologized to the president, saying I've been disrespectful. And I did. I apologized to Jimmy Carter. It was unfair to Jimmy Carter for me to make that comparison. And the reason I said that, the more serious meaning behind that, is that Jimmy was incompetent, but I think Jimmy Carter did believe in American exceptionalism. President Obama may be the first president we have ever elected that actually does not believe in American exceptionalism. Now, what does it have to do with military spending, investment, and preparation? First of all, I think it is important to understand that a stronger America leads to a more peaceful and predictable world. America is a force for good. That used to be a fairly uncontroversial statement, but when you look at this administration's policies, they seem to pursue multilateralism as a goal, not as a tactic. The reality is that America must be ready not just to defeat any potential adversaries, but to dominate any conflict. And there used to be a bipartisan consensus that that was the right approach to America's investments in defense and in our foreign policy. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. We are now at a time spending a greater share of our economy. These last few years, we're spending a greater share of our economy on the federal government's budget, while at the same time spending a smaller share on our defense at any time since World War II. And I think that's a very dangerous, dangerous trend. And so I certainly think that, and I call on Republicans in Congress, and I certainly call on any Republican that's thinking about running for president to stand up today. This week, I know that the Houses, the Congress, is proposing, they're beginning consideration of a budget. The first time since we've had both chambers in some years, we'll now be in a position to pass a budget. And there are debates going on about what that budget should look like. And I would call on our Republican leaders in the House and the Senate, and any Republican thinking about running for president, to insist and make it clear that we have to invest in defense. We have to invest in the Pentagon. We've got to increase our investment to make sure that America's military, our fighting men and women, are ready, that we give them the best training, the best equipment. It is unconscionable, it's unacceptable what we're allowing to happen now. We are going to have fewer planes, fewer ships, fewer troops, older equipment than at any time in decades. At a time when the threats are increasing, when others are investing more and more in their own capabilities. Now, some time ago, Jim Talent and I authored a paper on what needs to happen for America to invest in our military and to prepare in terms of how it impacts our foreign policy. And I'd recommend folks to read that paper. We called for America to get back to investing 4% of our GDP in the military, in the Pentagon. Now, certainly there are reforms that need to be made. Yes, we need to reform procurement. Yes, we've had an explosion of civilian contractors. Yes, we've seen cost overruns, and there are changes, specific changes we recommend. But that's no excuse for us to fail to invest in our military. The reality is, I think the Republicans made a mistake when they accepted the sequestration caps on defense spending. I think this increased investment in defense spending needs to be offset by other cuts in other non-defense portions of the budget. Let's be clear, the Constitution says that there is one thing the federal government must do. The federal government must protect us. The reality is this is the first and most important responsibility of our government. Under the Obama administration, the federal government has grown to such size, such intrusiveness, as doing so many other things that it's not focusing on its core priorities. So the first point I want to make is this. It is absolutely critical that we invest in our military. We stop the hollowing out of our military. This may be one of the more dangerous legacies this administration leaves to their successors. And it is time for Republicans to stand up and unite as a party. And I recognize I'm saying this at a time of record of $18 trillion and counting. We can't afford $18 trillion and more of debt. We can't afford this new entitlement program called Obamacare. We can't afford the president's proposal for free community college. We can't afford this president. But we can't afford not to invest in our military. And we can do it while at the same time we're cutting other non-defense spending to make sure we continue and get on a path to fiscal responsibility. But it would be irresponsible to continue the path we're on today that hollows out our military, that is men and women we send towards harm to protect us, and it's not right for our successors as well. The second thing I want to talk about, the second issue, and these are all related to foreign policy, is what we must do to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear-armed power. First of all, why this is such a dangerous threat. Let's be clear, a nuclear-armed Iran is not just an existential threat to Israel. It's not just an existential threat to our European allies. It's an existential threat to the United States of America. And it won't end with Iran. If Iran were allowed to become a nuclear power, I believe you would see Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia also want nuclear weapons. I believe some of those countries may already have deals with the Pakistanis to buy that technology. And once we fail to stop Iran, we will be in no position to stop these other countries. So you could then have multiple countries in the Middle East that are now nuclear-equipped, nuclear-capable powers. Talk about a volatile and dangerous situation. I fear this president wants a deal so badly he prefers a bad deal over no deal. I actually, and I'm here to say that I strongly support Senator Cotton and his efforts to make it very clear that any bad deal signed by this president is not binding on the next administration, especially if it does not submit that deal to Congress for its approval. The president can't have it both ways. He can't say that he is authorized to do this deal without approval by Congress, and yet it is still binding on the next administration. I think the Congress should do two things today. I think, one, they should pass legislation making clear any deal should come to them for ratification, and secondly, they should increase the sanctions on Iran. There's bipartisan legislation. Let's give this president the leverage that for some reason he doesn't want at the negotiating table. And I know that the White House has done a very good job distracting our attention. So they attacked Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, for coming to speak because apparently the protocols, they believe the protocols weren't followed. The invitation didn't come from the right place. Now they're attacking Senator Cotton again on an issue of protocols. This is more important than whether we're eating with the right salad fork at dinner or not. This is about whether we allow Iran to become a nuclear power. The administration has done a great job distracting us. They've done a great job focusing on everything but the substance of the deal. The reality is, if you listen to this administration, you think our most dangerous Senate Republicans, or maybe the Prime Minister of Israel, or maybe medieval Christians pursuing crusades. That's not the threat that faces us today. I actually said half jokingly to the president, I would keep an eye out on the medieval Christians if he would do his job and keep an eye out and counter the threat of radical Islamic terrorists. And that gets me to my third topic, but on the second topic, I want to commend Senator Cotton. And as I did before, I'd call for anybody thinking about running for president to sign on to the letter. I'm glad that 47 senators did. I'd call anybody, Republican or Democrat, thinking about running for president to sign on to this letter and make it very clear that a nuclear-armed Iran is not an acceptable outcome. And the reality is, and I'd be happy to talk about this further, I think this administration's obsession with a deal with Iran has led to many foreign policy missteps. I think it's one of the reasons that Secretary Kerry actually said, I know they had to walk this back, but he actually said they'd be open to talking with Assad, even though I thought it was our administration's policy that we were for the overthrow of the Assad regime. I think it's one of the reasons they've allowed Iran to play a greater role in Iraq, in Lebanon, and Syria. It may be, and I don't have proof of this, it may be one of the reasons they're not pushing as hard as I think they should on Putin and Russia in the Ukraine. There have been articles written by others suggesting that this administration's desire to get a deal with Iran, no matter whether it's a bad deal or not, is actually driving many missteps, and that has driven many foreign policy missteps for many years, going back to his very first year in office, going back to the Green Revolution to where we are today. But my second point, and let me be very clear about this, a nuclear-armed Iran is one of the worst legacies this administration could leave their successors. It is absolutely critical that we not allow that to happen. My third and final topic I want to talk about today, all in the realm of foreign policy, and that comes to the issue of defeating the enemy named ISIS, defeating our radical Islamic terrorist enemies. The reason the president has trouble actually identifying our enemies by name. He doesn't like to use those words. I said on the White House lawn, I know this was a breach of protocol as well, so we're talking about breaches of protocol, the Cotton letter, inviting Netanyahu to speak. I guess I wasn't supposed to get outside the White House and actually answer a question honestly or criticize the president. I was asked a question and I responded honestly saying that I think that, and it doesn't give me joy to say this, I think the president's disqualified himself to be our commander-in-chief. And I don't say that as a Republican, I don't take any joy in that. The reason I say that is, one, he somehow, for whatever reason, does not like to name the enemy we face, but secondly, let's review what this enemy has been doing. This is an enemy that has killed over 100 school children in Pakistan. It's an enemy that is killing cartoonists because they didn't like their editorial decisions. It's an enemy that has beheaded Egyptian Christians, burned alive a Jordanian pilot, that is killing, torturing, and otherwise injuring innocent Muslims, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. And you listen to this administration's response. We hear our president tell us we're not at war with Islam. Well, of course we're not at war with Islam. We shouldn't have to say that, but of course we are at war with radical Islam and radical Islamic terrorists. You've got our Attorney General telling us we're not at a time of war. You've got the State Department, you've got an official at the State Department saying we're not going to kill our way to war, or kill our way out of this war. Well, how else do we win wars except for killing our way to victory in war? You've got the department, again, you have the same official saying that we need a jobs program or better governance. It's one of the most ridiculous things I've heard. So apparently we're not at war with radical Islamic terrorism, but we are at war with international poverty. You listen to the comments of this administration and you look at their policies and you look at what they've failed to do. The reality is this president talks about the Crusades. He talks about criticizing, his administration criticizes Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, for warning our country about the threat of a bad deal, of a nuclear-armed Iran. And maybe then you understand why I say that it doesn't bring me joy. It saddens me to say that he has disqualified himself to be our commander-in-chief. You know, I gave a speech in London where I talked about the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. And I said some things that made the left mad. Folks said that I was racist or anti-Muslim or I had a colonial perspective, and that's nonsense. And their criticism won't stop me from speaking out. Two very important points I made. One, that Islam has a problem, and that individual Muslim leaders must speak out. Clerics must do more than just denounce generic acts of violence. They've got to condemn the individuals by name who are committing these acts of violence. They need to make it clear these individuals are not martyrs going to enjoy a reward in the afterlife. Rather, these terrorists are going straight to hell. But the second thing that has to happen, and this got a little less attention, was that we in the West have a responsibility as well. In the West, I believe we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to insist that those that come into our societies, those that come into our country, assimilate and integrate. Now, what does that mean? That means that in America, we don't discriminate against anybody, and we shouldn't, by race or by creed, for those that want to come into our country. But we do insist that folks should not come into our country and use the freedoms we give them to undermine the freedoms we grant to everybody. So in other words, we shouldn't tolerate those who want to come and try to impose some variant or some version of Sharia law. We shouldn't allow those that want to come in here and use the freedoms of self-expression, freedom of religion, freedom of speech that we grant to all to undermine those same freedoms for others. Because make no mistake about it, the enemy that we face, radical Islamic terrorism, is an enemy that treats women as second-class citizens. It is an enemy infected with evil that wants to destroy us, You know, one of the great strengths of America is that we have traditionally been this great melting pot. We don't care whether you've been here 5 minutes or 100 years. We welcome folks who want to come to our country, that want to come and work hard, get an education, that want to come and join our military, that want to start businesses, and that's a great thing. My parents came here over 40 years ago in search of the American dream. They were coming to a concept as much as they were coming to this concept of freedom and opportunity. One of the things I believe as Americans is we need to move away from hyphenated Americans. We don't need to be viewing ourselves as Indian Americans or African Americans. We're all Americans. And we should be teaching English as our language. We should be teaching about American exceptionalism in our history classes and our and we shouldn't discriminate or treat folks differently because of their color, their skin, or their creed, but we should say, if you're coming into our society and you want our freedoms, you should respect those same freedoms for others. I fear if we don't insist on that, and it's not politically correct to say that anymore. Many would like to say we're no longer the melting pot, we're now the salad bowl. What I worry about is if we do that, we then go the way of Europe. And you see the challenges that many of those countries are facing. And I don't want to see that happen in the United States. Now, I know I've covered a lot of ground. I started by talking about the importance of investing in our military, calling on Republican leaders in Congress, anybody thinking about running for president, to make it clear we have to invest in our military. I would argue that we need to get back to our historic levels, close. We have historically invested 4% of GDP, and I'm not suggesting we do that overnight. It may take a few years for us to responsibly spend those increases, so to phase in those increases. Secondly, I talked about the importance of making sure we don't allow Iran to become a nuclear power. And the reality is that this administration seems to be insistent on pursuing a bad deal. They seem to fear no deal over signing a bad deal. And then finally, third, the need to not just contain and degrade or expel, but actually to hunt down and kill the enemy we call ISIS, radical Islamic terrorists. I'll close with this final observation, and I'll be happy to take any questions. And again, it doesn't have to be on the topics we've discussed. It can be on anything folks want to talk about. I'll close with this observation. I'm a complete optimist in America. I think we do face grave challenges. I think these are important decisions we're being called to make here in our nation's capital and across our country. But I also think our best days are ahead of us. I think my parents were right over 40 years ago when they came here in search of that freedom and opportunity, and when they realized they'd come to the greatest country in the history of the world. I know it's not inevitable, and I know that it's continuing to be that place, depends on the decisions we make. And that's why I think these decisions are so important. And that's why I think it is so important. We've got to invest in our military, stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power, and defeating the threat called radical Islamic terrorism. Thank you all very much for allowing me to come speak to you all today.
As the governor mentioned, he has agreed to answer some questions. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone. Please stand, identify yourself, identify your organization, and then ask your question in the form of a question, that is with a question mark at the end. And, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative. I came prepared to ask you if you had any regrets about signing on to the Iran letter. I think that question has been answered. But I was wondering how you would respond to the criticism that the White House leveled on the Prime Minister in saying that he has no plan. So how do you respond to criticism that says, well, you're complaining about us, but you don't have a plan for Iran?
To Prime Minister Netanyahu, you're saying? Yeah, a couple of things. Well, first of all, you said they have to end everything with a question mark. I want to share with you, maybe I should share this at the end of the question and answer period. There's a trick in the Louisiana legislature where legislators are required to ask questions when somebody else has the floor. They will get up and read the longest or articulate the longest statements you've ever heard and end it with, did you know, to make it a question. So if those of you looking for... Look, I think that the Prime Minister outlined very seriously the threats posed by Iran. I think that the plan, two things. One, bad policy leads to bad options. So I think this administration's dithering and weakness have brought us to a place where we have fewer good options than we did just a few short years ago. And that's that is the honest truth. That's uncontestable. You look back to the missed opportunities with the Green Revolution. You look back to the missed opportunities with the overthrow of the Assad regime, which could have reduced Iran's influence, which would have, I think, encouraged Turkey to take a more aggressive role on the ground against ISIS. Where do we go from here? The plan's pretty simple, and the plan's pretty obvious. Look, the UN's Iran that they shouldn't have enrichment capacity. We should not allow them in a pathway to a plutonium capability as well. And so any plan forward has got to involve, if we're going to have a deal with Iran, it's got to make sure that their enriched stockpiles are removed to a third country, only allowed to be used in Iran when it's certified they're being used for non-military purposes. There need to be verifiable oversight with immediate sanctions, not with long-term or short-term. Here's what I worry about. The deal we've heard about, best case scenario, we go from a situation where you had international agreement that Iran should not become a nuclear power with a consensus on sanctions to a situation where in 10 years, they're then allowed without sanction to have these capabilities. And in the meantime, they're allowed to continue their research into delivery mechanisms and other mechanisms and become even more efficient and more proficient. That's the best case scenario. More realistically, and I wouldn't even call this a worst case scenario, more realistically, you've got a regime that has consistently abrogated and violated previous agreements, whether it's the United Nations resolutions, whether it's non-proliferation requirements. And so I think we'd have every reason to believe that under the contours of the deal we're hearing about, they would continue to harden their facilities, continue to disperse and increase their enrichment capabilities. Part of what we're handicapped by is that while this president shares in secret materials with the leaders in Iran, he doesn't see fit to share those same materials with our congressional leadership. I think one of the reasons you saw this letter from Senator Cotton and so many other senators was the frustration that the administration's not being more open with them and the American people and making its case. If this is such a good deal, why can't we hear the details as well? So I think the path forward is pretty straightforward. I think that if Iran's not willing to abide by those deals, by those terms, the reality is with falling oil prices and with a unified international community, we're in a much stronger position. We're in a much stronger position to deny them the ability to continue on the path that they're on. And so that's one of the reasons I believe they should pass the sanctions bill. Let's give this president the leverage he doesn't seem to want. He's the first president I've ever seen who has said to the Congress, don't make me stronger at the negotiating table. I have no idea why he wouldn't want that bipartisan bill and then have more leverage with the Iranians.
Hi, Rachel Bade with Politico, tax reporter. I have a two-part question for you. Republicans in Louisiana right now, it sounds like some of them are angry because in some sort of retreat in Baton Rouge, the revenue chief said something about how you won't sign any sort of new revenue agreement without Americans for Tax Reform saying that it's not a tax increase. First of all, can you comment on that? Second of all, there seems to be some headbutting between Americans for Tax Reform that says if you get rid of credits and deductions, that could be a tax increase, and some of your colleagues in Louisiana, Republicans, saying, well, we need to find new revenue. These aren't necessarily tax increases. It seems like you're agreeing with Americans for Tax Reform, but can you clarify that, and if any
Sure.
way you would potentially agree with the state?
Two things. I've been very clear, and I've said this every time I've run for office. I'm absolutely against raising taxes. I think it would be a mistake, and Fred did a very nice job. He was very generous in his introduction to me. I think it'd be a mistake to hurt the private sector economy to help the government economy. So in Louisiana, since I've been governor, we have cut and eliminated several onerous business taxes. We did the largest income tax cut in our state's history. And as a result, we've also reduced the size of government. We've cut our budget 26%, we've cut over 30,000 state government employees. Our private sector economy is stronger than it's. We've actually grown now almost twice as fast as the national economy and nearly 3 times as fast when it comes to private sector job creation. We're a top 5 state for private sector job creation since I've been governor. Reversed a 25-year out-migration, 7 years in a row of more people moving into the state rather than leaving the state, 8 credit upgrades. So the highest credit ratings in decades, more people working in Louisiana at a higher income, more people living there than ever before, fewest number of state employees in decades. My philosophy about taxes is pretty simple. I'm against tax increases, period. Now, what we have proposed in our budget proposal to the legislature is there are refundable tax credits that exceed a taxpayer's actual tax liability. Large checks from the state of Louisiana. In my mind, that's spending. And that's the same as spending on health care and education. I think it's reasonable to look at that, and some of that's corporate welfare. I think it's reasonable to look at that and say this money would be better spent on health care or education. So if somebody's using a tax credit to reduce their tax liability, I think that's a tax cut. If somebody's actually getting money above and beyond what they're paying into the state, to me that's spending. And I think it's fair game to look at that and say, why in the world would we not want to at least look at that the same way we look at education or healthcare or other spending as well? In terms of, this is my 8th session, my 8th budget, 7 years in a row now, we've not raised taxes, we've balanced the budget every year. We'll do it again this year as well. And I've made it very clear, I'll veto any tax increase, I'll veto any budget that includes a tax increase. But again, refundable tax credits that exceed somebody's tax liability, I think in many cases that's spending. There have been some of these rebates that have grown much faster than they were originally projected. They've grown much faster than when they were presented to the legislature, and I think it makes sense. I think it's fiscally responsible to look at some of those programs and see if that's the best way to spend those dollars. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I'll stop calling on people.
Hi, I'm Gregory Roberts. I'm with the Advocate newspaper. I'm here in D.C. So I'm curious, when you talk about the melting pot and the salad bowl, and we have to make sure that people who come here don't believe in Sharia law, et cetera. Do you want to impose some kind of a belief test on immigrants? Whereas my understanding is that we live in a country where people are allowed freedom of belief, so that even if somebody believes in Sharia law, they can live free in America just so long as they don't break the law.
Sure, and Greg, the line I would draw is you have the right to believe whatever you want in our country as long as you're not harming somebody else. And so I think the place you draw that line is, yes, and that's why I said we don't discriminate on people based on their beliefs, their creeds, or their color of their skin, but we do think it's wrong for people to try to impose those beliefs on others. So for example, in Europe, you've got neighborhoods where women outside those neighborhoods don't feel comfortable going in unless they're wearing veils or other type of attire. That's wrong. We shouldn't allow that to happen here. And I think the way we start is, like I said, I think there's nothing wrong with us insisting English is our language, with us teaching in our history and our civics classes about American exceptionalism and the history of this great country. Now, I don't think we are where Europe is, but I fear we could get there. I fear we could get there if you see this political correct approach continue. And you see it dominant in university circles, in certain media circles, among elites, but not amongst everyday Americans. And that's why I think there are steps we could take today, like moving away from this hyphenated American approach, moving away from some of these other approaches. But you're absolutely right that we would never discriminate against somebody for their beliefs, but we would discriminate if they try to use those beliefs to undermine the freedoms of other people. And that's where we have to draw the line. And one of the great things about this country is you're absolutely free to believe in any faith or no faith at all, but you're not free to impose that. You're not free. When you try to take away the freedoms of other people, that's when you cross the line. One of the things that worries me culturally is you look at second, third generation immigrants in some of these European countries, many of them don't consider themselves part of those countries. And one of the great things about our country is that very quickly people consider themselves Americans. When it comes to our immigration system, an immigration system can either make our country stronger or weaker. I don't think there's anything wrong at all with saying we're going to allow people into our country who want to be Americans. And if you don't want to be an American, there are other places you can go. You can stay where you came from, you can go somewhere else. But I think it's common sense to say we're going to prioritize and say if you want to be an American, then you're the kind of person, we're going to prioritize that over somebody who doesn't want to be an American trying to come into our country. It's fine with me if it's fine with you.
All right. You say you're against people who would try to impose their beliefs on others. Isn't that what political discourse is about? You would like to impose your beliefs about reproductive freedom on others. Some people would say you're trying to deny their freedom. And isn't that what political discourse is about, arguing your position and trying to impose your belief through the democratic process?
Greg, I would distinguish between people who are pro-life and radical Islamic terrorists. No, I think those are two different things. And so I think folks that are living in neighborhoods, and I wouldn't equate those two. I wouldn't. So I think there is something different and wrong. There are neighborhoods, again, in Europe, where the police will tell you they're less likely to be called in response to serious crimes. You have the right to have whatever beliefs you want. You don't have the right to come here and impose those beliefs in a way that infringes on the freedoms of other people. And so you can't come into our country and say, I'm going to have religious liberty rights, but you're not allowed to have those rights. You're not allowed to draw these cartoons. So, for example, you're not allowed to come into our country and say that the Advocate's not allowed to publish cartoons that I find offensive. What we say in America is if you don't like those cartoons, don't buy the paper. Now, don't tell John I said that, but I mean, or don't read the paper. Don't read that paper that day. So I do think there's a difference between having a belief and trying to impose it on other people. And the editorialist, look, the rampage against the cartoonist in Paris is a great example of that. You're absolutely right to have the belief that you don't want certain images drawn or you don't want certain things printed, but you don't have the right to go and stop other people from printing and reading. And so I think that's where we draw the line. And historically, that's where we've drawn the line in this country. My point is a great source of strength in our country. You know, we don't discriminate. We don't tell people who want to come into our country, you have to believe like we do. Historically, we've been a majority Christian country, built on Judeo-Christian values, but we don't say you have to be a Christian to live here or a Jewish to live here, or we don't discriminate against people that aren't Christian or aren't Jewish or have no belief or have different beliefs, and that's a great thing. And what I'm saying is I don't want to see that change. I think that was a great thing my parents discovered in Baton Rouge when they came over 40 years ago. It didn't matter what your last name was. You could literally call folks in the phone book and get a job. It didn't matter where you'd come from. I don't want to see that change. And what I worry about, especially when you see what's happening in Europe and you listen to what you hear in these some of these elites in the university circles and the media elites, is that they do want to change that. And they don't like this idea of a melting pot. It's not culturally arrogant to say that we believe in freedom here. And we believe in for everybody to have that freedom. And it's not your right to stop somebody else from having those freedoms of self-expression, religious liberty, and freedom of speech. So I think the line we have to draw is, yes, you have the right to believe what you want. You don't have the right to impose on other people's freedoms.
Hi, my name is Neil Monroe. I'm a reporter with the Daily Caller. Yes, I arrived here some years ago on a 747, and before I got in, I had to swear I was the Communist Party Soviet Union, that I wasn't a Nazi concentration camp guard. I also gave up foreign loyalty to foreign potentates. I quit any claims to foreign nobility and awards like knighthoods. So within rules, would you expand those rules to update them? For example, to say, sorry, we won't provide residency or citizenship to members of the Islamic State or perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood?
Absolutely. I think it's pretty... themselves to be a member of the Islamic State, I absolutely think we would consider them, as a group that has declared war on America, that is a group that has declared war on the West, a group that has declared war on our fundamental beliefs. I think it'd be absolutely reasonable. And this question actually came up last year during the campaign season. There was a discussion not just on not allowing people who have joined the Islamic State not to come in here, there's a question about Americans who may have gone abroad to join those groups and being careful about allowing them to come back into our society.
Would you include the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I think it depends on the beliefs and what the person is proclaiming when they say, look, I think that the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, includes ideologies that are hostile to our interests and our beliefs. And so it would depend on what the individual means when they say they're joining the Muslim Brotherhood. What does that mean? I think it's a good thing that they're no longer in power in Egypt. I think when they were in power, they weren't nearly as helpful in the fight against radical Islamic terrorists, whether in Gaza or elsewhere. And I think that certainly El-Sisi is not a perfect leader, and there are a lot of legitimate concerns we have with his administration, but I think that their involvement in the Middle East has become more constructive since the Muslim Brotherhood is no longer in power there. So certainly I think that the Muslim Brotherhood, the leadership involves many beliefs that aren't consistent with America's foreign policy interests. But again, I think it would depend on what that person means. I also know there may be others that ascribe to the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe not in leadership positions, and I'd want to know, what does that person mean when they say that they've joined the Muslim Brotherhood? Did they join it because of a social welfare program, or do they really truly believe the core beliefs as espoused by the leadership? The Islamic State, I think, is pretty unambiguous. I think the Islamic State's made it pretty clear that these are terroristic thugs. But again, the Muslim Brotherhood, just to be very clear about this, I do think that the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood has embraced ideas and principles that are antithetical to our interests and our policies. Good thing they're no longer running Egypt. And I think there's a reason. We have, for years, considered the Muslim Brotherhood a suspect organization. I think there's a reason we viewed them with suspicion. Because, again, I think that their leadership, at the very least, has embraced policies, has embraced views that are antithetical to our values.
Hi, Chad Miller, Education Policy here at American Action Forum. If I could get you to shift gears to Common Core.
Sure.
Two questions. One, if state leaders make the decision to continue down the road of implementing Common Core, could you support that decision? And two, voting around Congress right now that strictly prohibits the federal government's involvement in Common Core. I'm wondering if that language goes far enough to address your concerns of federal overreach.
Sure. A couple of things. One, I absolutely support the right of parents to make the fundamental choice for their children. I think the ultimate accountability is the dollars following the child, not making the child follow the dollars. I think curriculum decisions should be made at the local level. I oppose Common Core for two reasons. One, fundamentally and philosophically, it's a top-down, federally imposed approach, one size fits all. Secondly, I think the standards are just bad. I think when you actually look at the way they're trying to teach math, I think when you look at the changes to ELA, I think this is a bad way to do this and to teach our kids. If you're asking me, and to answer both your questions, I think it'd be great if the federal government would get out of trying to coerce states in a Common Core. Even if they were to do that, I would still advocate for Common Core to be removed out of Louisiana. I don't think it represents the highest quality standards. I don't think it represents the way we should be teaching our kids. I think that, and again, I'd be happy to talk at length about the math and how they're moving away from approaches even PhD commonsensical. They're de-emphasizing getting the right answer at a lower grade. They're moving away from the emphasis on Euclidean geometry. The way they're teaching just subtraction and addition is different than how many of us learn. I think it's very frustrating. It's not intuitive to many students. But regardless, the way that Common Core standards were developed without input, without transparency, without an opportunity for parents, for teachers, for others to provide input, I think was a mistake and a rush. So I think it would be a positive step if the federal government would end its involvement in trying to coerce states to get into Common Core, meaning that they shouldn't be, for example, allowed to do no child left behind waivers tied to Common Core, or they wouldn't be allowed to say you can't get your own tax dollars back unless you have adopted Common Core. I think fundamentally the way to undo that, though, is to radically reshape the Federal Department of Education. And I've proposed a specific paper about how to do that. I think that we need to reduce its size dramatically. I think that it needs to be involved in transparency and civil rights and in deregulation, and that's it. It really doesn't need to be doing so many of the other things that it's doing. The other dollars and programs can either be block granted to the states, or when they're not having any impact, be eliminated, quite frankly. I think if you don't do that, even if you were to get rid of Common Core today, there'd be another iteration tomorrow. The reality is this isn't the first time the federal government's tried to get involved in a curriculum. It won't be the last time. Even if we win today, there'll be something else tomorrow we're going to have to fight. So on philosophical and content grounds, I'm opposed to Common Core. And I think it would be a positive step if they'd stop the federal government from coercing states into adopting it. But I would still advocate, even if the federal government ceased and ended its efforts tomorrow, I'd still be opposed to the use of Common Core in Louisiana.
So while we have you on domestic policy issues, I wanted to ask you, you're one of the few people to actually propose a full-scale health replacement plan for the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. Can you share with the group sort of what you view as the 2 or 3 key elements of that and why it is so important to do that?
Absolutely. And look, for a while now, I've said Republicans have to be for something, not just against something. So we unveiled this plan over a year ago. I think Congress should be voting on a plan, a repeal and replacement plan today, even before the Supreme Court rules. I think it's likely the Supreme Court will rule in our favor, getting rid of the individual, not only the subsidies, but then by extension the employer mandate and much of the individual mandate in up to 37 states. But that's why I also think it's incumbent for Republicans to have a plan today, not wait for that ruling to happen. Now, I think there are 3 things Republicans have to avoid, and then one thing we've got to make sure, well, 2 things we've got to do. 3 things we've got to avoid. The temptation for already here, when I unveiled my plan, we heard this from Republicans in this town, was 1, that we need to create our own entitlement program. 2, that we need to raise new taxes, redistributive taxes. And then 3, we're going to count success by how many people have cards, not whether we actually reduce costs, regardless whether they have meaningful coverage or not, regardless of whether they actually get to see their doctors, regardless of whether the out-of-pocket amounts are not. I think all 3 of those are mistakes. I think all 3 of those lead us to becoming a cheaper version of the Democratic Party, proposing Obamacare light. The reality is, I think what instead Republicans need to President, then Senator Obama talked about, which was reducing cost and making health care affordable. When he was opposing the mandate proposed by then Senator Clinton, when he was opposing the Cadillac tax, then proposed by Senator McCain, he was very clear that the issue he wanted to focus on was reducing cost and making health care affordable. That's what I think we as Republicans need to do. And we have proposed a plan, 16 points. Independent components have been analyzed to show that it would reduce the cost for an average family by thousands of dollars, would increase coverage for millions. A few of the key components. Number 1, we do focus on reducing costs reduction through cross-state purchasing, through cracking down on frivolous lawsuits, through voluntary purchasing groups with ERISA-like protections, so you can buy insurance through organizations other than your employers. Secondly, we also protect the vulnerable, those that are the neediest. The reality is that this president was right to talk about the needs of those with pre-existing conditions or those priced out of the individual insurance market. We provide $100 billion. We guarantee access for those with pre-existing conditions. We help those who are those that have the greatest needs, those that are truly vulnerable. And we also reform Medicaid and Medicare as well. Third, and finally, we give to consumers portability and choice. They should own their coverage whether they move across state lines or they move across jobs. That doesn't happen often enough today. Now, whether the Congress adopts my plan or not, I'm glad to see that they're beginning now the discussion about debating a plan. The important thing is they do adopt an alternative. I'm glad whenever they vote to repeal Obamacare, but it's important they actually adopt a plan that replaces it. And this goes back to something I said in 2012. The Republican Party has got to be the party of solutions. We can't be the party of no. We can't be the stupid party. We've got to be the party of solutions. And indeed, one of the things I think we've got to do is show that we've got a better way of governing. That's how we earn our way into the majority, and that's, I think, we win in 2016. I've also said anybody thinking about running for president, I know a lot of folks are thinking about there. I would hope they would also think about what they would do when they get there. And it's one of the reasons we provided the plan on health care, on defense policy, on education policy, on energy policy. I think we need our next president to make big changes to get our country back on the right track. Part of that is health care, but part of that's energy, education, foreign policy, and other areas as well. So I would hope, and it doesn't have to be my plan. There are other plans. RRC's got a plan. Other people have plans out there. Let's have that debate. Let's pass that plan before the Supreme Court acts. Otherwise, the president's going to stand up there and demagogue this. And what I worry is that this Republican Congress may end up just giving in and surrendering. Now remember, they campaigned against Obamacare in red states, blue states, and purple states, and won overwhelmingly in November, and I'd argue in large part because of the unpopularity of Obamacare. Now's not the time for us to lose the courage of our conviction. So I think that we are well positioned to repeal and replace it, but it starts with putting forward a specific alternative on the table.
Thank you. Hey, Governor. Katie Glick with Politico. You mentioned possible next president, so this is related to that. Many of the potential 2016 contenders are expected to announce their decisions as to whether to run as soon as next month. I'm wondering if you can give us any specifics as to when you will be announcing a decision. I know sometimes you've said in the first half of the year, but if we could get a little more specific than that, and also if we could hear about what factors are driving a decision for you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Look, we're still a couple of months away, but this is the most important thing. I know folks are worried about fundraising and polling and consultants and all those things. We are more focused on what the next president needs to do. And so that is why we put out detailed policies on the 4 areas I mentioned: healthcare, education, energy, foreign/defense policy. We're giving great thought into what the next president should do. I think we need a president who wants to do something, not just be somebody. And quite honestly, I'm not sure why every other potential candidate isn't doing the same thing. I think that this is an important election. It's not going to be an election based on personalities or back in the 90s, there was this mistaken belief from some that maybe we were taking a vacation from history, that you could afford just to vote for whoever told the best joke or the best story. It was thought to be a time of peace and prosperity. In hindsight, even that view may not have been correct, but there was this idea that the elections, the consequences weren't as serious as they are today. I think this is a very important election about the direction of our country. I've made no secret of the fact I disagree with where our president is taking us. I think he has done great damage. I think he's bankrupting our country financially, morally, abroad as well. And I think the next president's going to have to make big changes, be somebody, an outsider who will come to D.C. and be willing to make big changes. So we're putting our time and effort into thinking about what the next president should do. We're still a couple of months away from making that decision. And again, I know others are focused on how to get there. We're more focused on what to do, what the next president needs to do if they do get there, when they do get there.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Robert Book of HSI Network. I just want to go back to what you talked about in your initial remarks about a nuclear Iran, and I'm sure as you also know that Iran's working on ICBMs, which they don't need to reach Israel, but they would need to reach the United States, and they do have a national holiday every November 4th called Death to America Day. And, not a joke, real thing.
No, I know.
And you also mentioned the degradation in the U.S. military capabilities during this administration. Are we reaching the point where we might, if Iran succeeds in developing an ICBM and nuclear weapons, that we might not have the ability to destroy that before it's used?
I think it's a great question. I do think that one of the reasons I believe, and again, I don't have direct evidence, but based on conversations, I do believe one of the reasons Prime Minister Netanyahu felt so compelled to come speak to us at this moment in time was I think they felt a moral responsibility that they couldn't look back and think they hadn't done everything they could to alert and warn them. I believe, and again, based on publicly available materials, that Israel was probably at the very edge of their capabilities, military capabilities, in terms of taking out Iran's nuclear infrastructure and at least delaying it by several years. I think when you look at the fact that these centrifuges have been hardened and dispersed and the hidden sites, that they're either right beyond or right at their capabilities. Now, America has got more robust military capability, but I don't think those capabilities are infinite. And I think we will reach that point soon. And I don't believe we're there yet, but I think we will reach that point soon where it is right at the edge, maybe just beyond our military capabilities. We will not have this capability for an indefinite amount of time. And I think that is of grave concern. I believe that is one of the reasons the Prime Minister felt so compelled to come warn the Congress and the American people and the international community to pay attention, because you've hit a very, very important point, that there is a point of no return. And that is why I believe if we were to get to that point, God forbid that if we were to get to that point, then I think you would see Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries also want that capability. And then America would not be in any position to stop those countries. If we couldn't stop Iran, how are we going to stop those countries as well? I think that is one of the reasons it's an urgent matter. That's one of the reasons I commend Senator Cotton for taking the action he did. Now, I know that the vice president insulted Senator Cotton, attacked Senator Cotton. I think he owes the senator an apology. The senator was actually boots on the ground in Iraq. He has put a lot of time and put a lot of he spent a lot of his time in capital in not only learning about but becoming informed on foreign policy issues. And I think this is an important debate for us to have. So I do share your concern. I think it's one of the reasons the Prime Minister came and spoke when he did. And I think it's certainly, separate from this, we do need to be investing in our military. And separately from this, I do think it was a mistake for the President to, back in 2009, remove unilaterally the missile interceptor technologies that were being deployed in Poland and the Czech Republic as part of the failed reset with Russia that then Secretary Clinton offered. Obviously, that didn't turn out so well. I think Putin looked at America, saw weakness, and I believe is in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine today. So I think there have been several missteps that have gotten us here today, but I absolutely do share that concern. I don't think we're out of the abilities of our military yet, but I do worry that day is coming sooner than later. And I do think that's one of the reasons the Prime Minister felt like he had a moral responsibility to come and alert the world. I do think that they want to do everything they possibly could. I don't think that they want to look back with hindsight and say, why didn't we try one more thing? So I think they were, for their own survival. And I think they take very seriously, by the way, when you've got mullahs and others in the regime saying not only calling America the great Satan, but talking about removing Israel from the face of the map. I mean, I think they take those threats very seriously.
Governor, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your remarks, your willingness to answer questions. Join me in thanking the Governor.
Thank you very much.